Hello, welcome to this week's revision video looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the examples of the Cold War getting very close to being hot. Berlin blockade is the other one. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the closest the world ever came to a nuclear war. It's a very common exam question. The examiners like it because it forces you to think about who was to blame, but also who won the conflict. And you can make a case for either the USA or the USSR, which is one of the things they like to see you do in an exam. It comes as a result of the growth of communism around the world between 1946 and 1960, and the way in which America feels very threatened by that. There is a sense in America in the 1960s that they could actually be losing this Cold War. If we look at the countries that have turned to communism, you've got China. For over 100 years, America had seen China as one of their closest friends in Asia. Between 1946 and 1949, America had given China $2 billion in aid. In 1949, despite all that aid, China had a communist revolution, led by Mao Zedong, and became a communist country. Many people in America were shocked by this, but also believed that America should have done far more to save China. A similar situation was happening in Korea. Korea had been ruled by Japan until 1945. In 1945, the northern half of Korea was liberated by Soviet troops and the southern half by American troops. Not surprisingly, like in Europe, North Korea then became a communist state. South Korea became a democracy, supported by the USA. In 1950, the communist North Korea invaded South Korea. American troops supported the South Koreans. Chinese troops supported the North Koreans. America did reasonably well. The North Korean troops were forced back into their own part of the country, and actually the line between the two was pushed much further north. But American troops could not defeat the communists in North Korea. They couldn't wipe it out. And the country of Korea became separated, which it still is today. The other, and potentially more embarrassing and more dangerous growth of communism came in Cuba. Cuba's a large island, 160 kilometers from Florida. Again, a long-term American ally. Many American businesses were on Cuba, and there was a large US naval base at Guantanamo Bay. For many years, the Americans had supported the president, Fulgencio Batista. Even though he was a dictator, he wasn't particularly nice, he was quite cruel to the local people and corrupt. In 1959, Batista was overthrown in a revolution by the communist Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Cuba is now a communist state, 160 kilometers from Florida, from the US borders. From 1960 onwards, Castro was also receiving weapons from the USSR. In April 1961, 1,400 anti-Castro Cuban exiles launched an invasion of Cuba. They aimed to overthrow Castro. The invasion was supported by the USA, who provided weapons, equipment and transport. There's even evidence now that they helped plan the whole attack. The exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and the invasion was a complete disaster. They were met by 20,000 Cuban communist troops armed with tanks and weapons from the USSR. All of those invading were captured or killed. This was embarrassing for the Americans. They'd helped to plan and fund an invasion which had failed, and it also hinted at a lack of strength, a lack of resolve. In some cases, this was hinted as cowardice. They hadn't wanted to invade themselves. The American president by 1962 is John F. Kennedy. On the 11th of September 1962, Kennedy made a statement in which he said, "The USA will prevent, by whatever means necessary, Cuba becoming an offensive military base," which means he is not going to allow Cuba to have nuclear atomic weapons. A month later, on Sunday the 14th of October 1962, a U-2 spy plane took a photograph over Cuba which showed missile bases being built. Another photograph showed 20 Soviet ships carrying missiles moving from the USSR towards Cuba. John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby, who was his senior advisor, made the following statement. Estimates are that the missiles have an atomic warhead power of about half the current missile capacity of the entire Soviet Union. The photographs indicate that missiles are directed at certain American cities. The estimate is that within a few minutes of their being fired, 80 million Americans will be dead. This may have been an exaggeration, but it's certainly enough to cause panic in America, and particularly in the White House, because this is seen as a direct challenge to Kennedy. The Soviet leader is Nikita Khrushchev. There's a number of reasons why he might have put the missiles on Cuba. It could be that he was trying to put the USSR into a stronger bargaining position with the USA. It could be that he simply wanted to defend Cuba from an American invasion. It could be that he wanted to get the upper hand in the arms race. After all, America already had missiles on Turkey, which could target the USSR. Russia is simply doing exactly what the Americans have already done. Or it could be that he wanted to test the determination of the USA and Kennedy in particular. Kennedy's the youngest American president. He won a very closely contested election in 1960, and there are some who still think he may be too young, too insecure, too pretty to be in a fight against somebody like Khrushchev. Once the Americans know that the missile bases are being built and that the weapons are on the way, John F. Kennedy has 5 options. Surgical air attack of the missile bases on Cuba, military invasion, diplomatic pressure through the United Nations, a naval blockade, or nothing. Each of those options has problems. The surgical air attack might work. It might not. It would certainly kill civilians on Cuba, and it would be America firing the first shot in a war. Similarly, a military invasion. Yes, it would probably work, but we know there are 20,000 troops in the Cuban army, and they're well equipped. They've got Soviet tanks and weapons. Lots of American soldiers would be killed. And again, America would have started a war. You could apply diplomatic pressure through the United Nations. That's going to take time. It's not going to be quick. And the longer it takes, the more likely it is that those nuclear weapons will be on Cuba. Kennedy could simply do nothing at all. After all, America has missiles in Turkey, but that's not going to do much for his image of looking tough. So the naval blockade is really the only option. It's not dissimilar to what happened in Berlin and what Stalin did in Berlin. What Kennedy is doing is putting an imaginary line around Cuba and saying to the Soviets, you're not crossing that. Technically, he hasn't got the right to do it. He doesn't own the ocean. But it does put the pressure now onto the Soviets. They've been given an ultimatum, so if they cross that line, they are starting the war. And there was a tense few days when those Soviet ships were getting closer and closer to that blockade line, and American warships were there and were prepared to fire. The Soviet ships stopped just before they crossed into the blockade zone. It was very, very close to the blockade zone. Considerable pressure was put on Kennedy by some of his advisors, particularly the army, to take firmer action, particularly when an American U-2 pilot who flew a little bit too low over Cuba was shot down and killed. That pilot was Major Rudy Anderson. Kennedy still held on. He wanted to make a deal. On Sunday the 28th of October, Khrushchev communicated directly with Kennedy and agreed to remove the missile bases in return for an American agreement to end the blockade and a promise by America not to invade Cuba. The crisis was over. 13 days of great tension had resulted in a compromise, and one that both sides could gain some credit from. For Cuba, they're still communist. They have missile bases but no nuclear weapons. They also, though, have a firm promise from America that they're not going to invade, and America never has done. Cuba is still a communist country. For Khrushchev, there is some success here. The fact that Cuba is still a communist country and a communist ally on America's doorstep is going to be very useful to them. And also Khrushchev was able to sort of demonstrate to the world that he wasn't Stalin. He wasn't a ruthless killer and a harsh dictator in the way that Stalin had been. Maybe he was somebody that could be talked to. For Kennedy too, despite Cuba still being communist, he came out of it looking pretty good. His image was greatly improved. He'd stood up to Khrushchev. He hadn't backed down. He'd stayed firm on the blockade. And America still had missile bases in Turkey. It did lead to a thaw in the Cold War. Not an end to it, but it was the last time really where America and the Soviet Union came very, very close to nuclear warfare. I think that scared both sides. I think everybody realised we could have made a huge mistake there. That could have been very, very bad. The following year, in 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed a nuclear test ban treaty, which limited the tests on nuclear weapons. And there is a very strong sense from this point on that nuclear is not going to be an option for war. So that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both sides could claim some sort of victory out of it. What it does is set the stage for the next step in the Cold War, which will be where you get the superpowers fighting by proxy, which means that they get other people to do the fighting for them. So America is going to back democracy against communism in Vietnam, and so they're going to go into the Vietnam War, which is the subject of the next video. If you want to watch more or find out more about the Cuban Missile Crisis, I would strongly recommend going and watching a film called 13 Days. It's a bit slow in places, it's a lot of talking, but it is very historically accurate and surprisingly tense. More fun, but nowhere near historically accurate as X-Men First Class. There were no mutants in the Cuban Missile Crisis. At least I don't think there were. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful.